Hey folks, it's Leah. Welcome to the channel. Thanks for joining me today. Today I want to talk about something that I've gotten some, I don't know if questions is the right word, some feedback about, which is something that I said in my conversation with my friend Elena around, I think how I phrased it and how I often frame it in my mind is that like fat justice is kind of like the final frontier for folks. I definitely got a little bit of sort of disapproving feedback from saying that, and I think the common thread in that feedback told me that there was something that people were not hearing, possibly because I didn't say it or because maybe I said it poorly or like it wasn't clear, whatever. That really is a crucial piece in what I mean when I say that. And so I wanted to clarify what I actually meant when I said that and go a little bit more in depth into it, because I think it's a concept that is a little bit more nuanced and that probably needs a bit more than just sort of like a phrase when I'm chatting with a buddy on our conversation that we're going to post on YouTube. So I want to talk about that today. So I'm going to talk about why I do still believe that fatness is sort of like a final frontier, one of the last acceptable forms of oppression or whatever. I'm going to dive into the details of that and sort of hopefully address some concerns and questions that folks had about my original statement, because this is a more complete version of how I feel about that. What I had originally said was we were talking about bullying and how the idea of poking fun at fat people is still very socially acceptable in the mainstream. So I think the example I gave was like I was listening to some kind of sort of left-leaning news or like commentary outlet. It might have been like Jon Stewart or something. I think it actually was Jon Stewart. And they're talking about how Trump is doing all these awful things to like queer people, and he's like terrible about trying to deport people because he's super racist and he's this and that. And so this is someone who is very like on the left and very like progressive, and he's talking about these social issues that are really important. And then in the process of talking about that, he cracks a fat joke. And so that was the example I gave. I think when we talk about fatness as sort of, as I said, like a final frontier, there are very progressive people who are not there. I think like the main thing is that even if you're very left, even if you're very progressive, even if like social justice stuff is very important to you, if you want that kind of positive social change, etc., you'll be like, oh yeah, so like sexism is a problem, transphobia is a problem, racism is a problem, all of these things, classism, disability, like all of these different things are issues where there is oppression and we need to fix that. A lot of leftists are like, yeah, all of this stuff matters. It's all, part of this system of oppression and it needs work. And then you say, hey, how about fatness? And they're like, nah, they did it to themselves. That's sort of the phenomenon I'm talking about. We don't really see that with other things. There isn't a lot of examples that I can think of literally any other identity or any other group of people that this group of people, liberals, progressive, leftists, whatever you want to call them, people who are interested and concerned about social issues, that they will just flat out say fat oppression is not a thing. Fat bias is not a thing. If there is a problem, you better pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? These are people who fundamentally do not believe in bootstrapping. They don't believe in blaming social problems on the individual until it's fatness. And then suddenly someone who is all about working on fixing systemic problems, etc., is like, you're the problem because you're the fat person. Suddenly that perspective changes. And it is so jarring. It's incredibly jarring. And a lot of it is around this idea that like fatness is a choice, which largely it is not. When we're talking about choice, please see a previous video I made where, one of the reasons people give us an excuse to be crappy to fat people is, well, it's a choice. And it's like, okay, but like, you're just looking for excuses to be bad to fat people. Like, what is wrong with you? We wouldn't do that to somebody who makes choices, with other identities, but suddenly if fatness is a choice. It's like, oh, it's okay for me to be crappy to you. It's okay for me to be mean and bully you and so on. So I think like part of it is that, but also people on the left, like straight up just do not think fat oppression exists. And I think part of that is like the kind of fat bias that we see is so subconscious that like if we're working on sort of our conscious brain level, it is bananas to think how biased actually we are about fat people. We think we're not at all biased about fat people, and we are super biased about fat people. Let me give you some data. Harvard designed this study, it's like an online test that you can take. It's called the implicit bias test. Basically, it's this test where you go through different scenarios and you give responses and so on. And it measures your explicit bias, which means the biases that you might be aware of. So you might say like, how would you say you feel about gay people or whatever? And you would sort of report how you think you feel about gay people. How do you feel about people of color? How do you feel about, it'll ask you all these different things. It has 6 different groups that it works with. I can't remember exactly what all the groups are, but certainly like race is in there, gender is in there, and fatness is definitely in there. They basically study the explicit bias, which is what people self-report. They'll say, what do you think of the competence of women versus the competence of men, or, things like that. And then the implicit bias they report by giving an exercise where it's quick enough that your subconscious mind has to do it. And it measures the stuff that you're not aware of, which is the implicit bias, the stuff that's underneath that you're not really consciously doing. And it measures that. In this test, they had millions of people complete this test. It's actually, I think it's still online. I think you can still take it. I've taken it. It's a really fascinating test. Over the course of about a decade, they collected data from millions of users. And what they found was that between, I think it was around 2010 to 2019 was the period that they were working with, they found that there was a lot of really great progress. So even in that short period of time, they saw that like homophobia substantially decreased in both the explicit feelings and the implicit feelings. So people reported that they felt more neutral or positive towards gay people. And they also, in their test with the implicit sort of subconscious stuff, it also reflected that. The same is true of racism. The same is true of all of the different identities except fatness. Everything else improved, and fatness actually got worse. In the explicit bias part where they're self-reporting, they said, oh yeah, I feel fine about fat people. It stayed about the same over the period. It stayed about the same. But the implicit bias, the subconscious stuff, it got worse by like 30%. It was really bad. And so this is what I mean when I say that like fatness is really just not acknowledged at all as like a social issue. We really think we're doing fine on fatness. But the moment that we actually trigger something to like communicate with our subconscious brain, we're like, oh yeah, fat people are pieces of shit. That's what happens. That's what we see in this research. I don't know how to impress on people better than that how much all of these different social issues exist. And certainly I'm not saying we've solved racism, solved transphobia, solved homophobia, solved sexism. Like that's not at all what I'm saying. That stuff all exists. And there are tons and tons of like systemic and microaggression sort of scenarios where people are dealing with shit for identities and they shouldn't be. That's absolutely still true. We haven't solved any of those. Those issues are still really, really pervasive. The thing is, progressives believe that. And they don't tend to believe that fat issues are issues. They don't tend to believe that fat bias is something that needs to be worked on. When we bring it up, you can have somebody who their whole life has been this staunch liberal or leftist, and they will basically be like, oh, but fat people just need to lose weight. There's this lovely woman, Aubrey Gordon, who does this podcast I love called Maintenance Phase. And she told this story about, it was a dreadful story. It was so hard to listen to, about being like really severely targeted by somebody on an airplane. And so she went to a buddy and she was sort of trying to like blow off some steam and like rant about it a little bit. And she told this buddy of hers who she thinks, oh yeah, he's like super progressive. He's been this like lifelong like union guy. Like he's been working with like working class people for forever. He's really into like social issues and stuff, and very, very progressive, very like leftist. She says, what happened? And all of a sudden this man who was like super for the people and really like pro-social progress and all this stuff is like, well, the airlines have to make money too, and this and that and the other. And it suddenly he's like pro large airlines as a union guy is suddenly like pro corporation. And that's exactly the phenomenon I'm talking about, where we have people who are like, Jon Stewart is not a conservative. He's not. He is very left, and he is interested in furthering left principles, but then he throws fat jokes in. And if you asked him, he would probably say, I don't discriminate against everyone. I want everyone to be equal. But we are so brainwashed by the messaging around fat people that it's all subconscious. We don't even know we're doing it. And so I think in those cases, we have to be extra careful to make sure that we're not making claims like, I'm not part of the problem. We're probably all of us part of the problem. Every single one of us, including me, including fat people, including thin people, including everybody. I think it's really important to note that like when you say, and we saw this a lot when we were talking about stuff around like Black Lives Matter, where people were like, all lives matter or whatever. And it's like, okay, fine, all lives matter, but like not all lives are in jeopardy from like police violence in the same way that Black lives are, right? It's sort of like, you know, the example someone gave is like you're sitting at the table and like, you know, Joe has no food and, you know, somebody says, well, Joe deserves food. And you say, well, we all deserve food. And it's like, okay, we all deserve food, but all of us have food except Joe, right? Like that's why we draw attention to Joe, right? Because he doesn't have any. So I think it's really important for us to do that also with fatness, while like it is something that like it doesn't mean that other issues are not important, but it is important to draw attention to how pervasive it is and how little recognition that kind of bias and discrimination gets. It is not just a case of hurt feelings. A lot of people really think that it's a case of hurt feelings. It's not. It's a case of you can't get a job. You're getting paid less for the same job as other people because you're fat. You can't get medical care, so you're dying disproportionately young because you go in with a stomach pain and over 2 years they tell you, oh, you just have to lose weight. And then by the time they figure it out, you have stage 4 colon cancer. That's what I'm talking about. These stories over and over again that I've heard around just trying to like fly from point A to point B, where people are booted off of flights, not refunded for their ticket just because they're fat and someone kicked up a fuss. These are not things about hurt feelings. This is like loss of livelihood, inability to travel, inability to keep a job, inability to get medical care. This is not about hurt feelings. This is about like actual survival. And this is why this is an actual oppression issue. People can't survive when they're fat. They are prevented from properly being able to live self-determined and fulfilling lives in the way that we have historically and continue today to prevent other groups as well from living fulfilling and autonomous lives. Oppression is oppression. We need to acknowledge that that is what is happening, but we don't. I bet you anything, Leah's Law, that's a callback to, I'll link it above. That's a callback to another video. I bet you anything, the entire comment section is going to be validating what I am saying right now. It's going to be full of people who are like, no, you're fat because you made choices. That's not oppression. Because that's how we think about fatness. And that needs to change. And that's what I mean when I call fatness the final frontier. It's not about whether or not we have work to do to solve the problem. It's about whether or not we acknowledge that there's a problem in the first place. For my part, I'm going to continue doing what I can to fight all forms of oppression. I will do my part to continue to further justice for every marginalized community. And for me, that includes fat people. I really encourage anyone else who is interested in social progress, who is interested in furthering justice for people who are marginalized, to really consider how that might come to include fat people. This is more of a serious one. I know I try to joke around a lot, but I just wanted to make sure that people knew that I was taking this subject as seriously as I should, and that I don't consider that like fatness is like more important than any other identity. I'm very aware that there's a lot of stuff that we need to fix. There are a lot of different groups who are being targeted by systemic problems or microaggressions. We've seen a wild rise in anti-trans violence. We've seen a wild rise in anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States right now. It is extremely, extremely important that we work on these issues. All I ask is that we admit that fatness fits into there somewhere as well. So thank you for joining me today. I know this was a rougher one. But if you learned something or you found this interesting, please throw a like on the video. And if you would like to follow along as I upload every week on Wednesdays, please subscribe and hit the little bell notification to get a notification when new videos are up. Thank you so much again for joining me. We'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye for now.